Welcome to Thriving in Business and Life. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Welcome back to the program.
So we've been progressing through kind of our 12 principles, you could say, of how to create a thriving culture. And last week we were talking about inclusion, which had followed talking about resources and so forth. Now we're going to explore something, Will, that is a favorite of you and me, both because we understand how powerful it is and how much it's easy to not do it.
Well, yes, our topic is responsibility, and off the bat, we're going to talk about the difference between responsibility and accountability. And I think you and I are both kind of word geeks. We really appreciate the power of words, and during my writing career, I've often just said to people, there's a reason we call it spelling. You know, right. The right arrangement of letters is called spelling, and spells cast spells. So words are very powerful, and it's important to know the meaning of them.
Well, you know, when I first was introduced to this idea, it was something that was new to me, and it ends up being new to a lot of our clients as well. The very first idea was that responsibility is a mindset.
Right.
In other words, if I see myself as responsible going in, what I'm going to do about it is very different than if I don't see myself as responsible.
Yeah, in other words, responsibility as an initial condition, you could say. And what gets in people's way often is the misunderstanding that responsibility is synonymous with accepting blame.
Right. So, yeah, just again, talking about mindset, right? So if I see responsibility as blame, then I'm looking for ways to make sure I cover my tail, CYA, as they say, right?
Yeah, like I want to make sure I'm not held responsible for this, which means I don't want to be blamed for this.
Yeah, I don't want it to be my fault. So if that's the game we're playing, responsibility becomes very divisive. It can become, something people try to evade, or they're really happy to accept responsibility for success, but
right.
but not for failure.
I did this, but I didn't do that.
Right. So one of the things we talk about is to create a thriving culture. A way to play that game is to uncouple blame from responsibility and instead look at responsibility as a way of amping up or increasing our power.
Right, and a way of being more effective.
Yeah.
Because that's really the point. It's really ironic when you think about the implications of responsibility and blame so interwoven the way they are in a lot of people's experience, because you have people who want to be effective. I doubt that there's many people walking around who really dream about being ineffective. So most of us want to do a good job. We want to enjoy what we're doing, produce something worthwhile. So just match that with this misunderstanding of responsibility that we're kind of pushing and pulling at the same time. We want to do a good job, and yet we're hesitant to take responsibility because we might get blamed. This is really a big deal in terms of effectiveness.
Well, it is, and we can walk through all three elements, and then as you were describing that, Will, I was thinking about a current situation we could use as an example. So if responsibility is a mindset, and it impacts how much we're willing to do or how much of ourselves we put into creating an outcome, you could say that empowerment is what shows up in the behavior box. How much of my ability and resources and connections am I going to tap into? And then accountability is in the result box. Am I willing to own the results of what I or we have created?
Yeah, so those are the three, and I'm just going to repeat those because we'd like this to be simple and memorable. We've got mindset of responsibility. We've got behaviors, feeling empowered, and we've got results, which is being accountable.
And let me take that a step farther, even more than feeling empowered, actually a willingness to tap into my ability.
Well, yeah, and that's a really good distinction because we can feel all kinds of things, but if we don't tap into the feeling and then act on it, it doesn't really make any difference in the world.
Right. So if we think about the recent grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX 8, we used this example a week or two ago as well because it's current. So let's think about that. We don't know the whole history, but we know enough now to start to get some insight. Had Boeing, who, by the way, was doing their own certification process instead of it being third party.
Well, and that's increasingly prevalent because the FAA doesn't have the funds to do it themselves, so they farm that out to the manufacturers.
Right. So if the manufacturer said, we are responsible for the outcome of this plane, whatever happens, we own it.
Right.
It's ours. Now,
there's the mindset right there.
Yeah, that's the mindset. If that was fully there, then in the behavior box, it's who do we empower? How do we involve and utilize our resources? We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. Who do we include? We talked about that with inclusion. How do we assess the current situation? All those things come into gear if we are seeing ourselves as fully responsible. And then when it goes wrong, the chances of it going wrong, by the way, are less if we truly entered into it. But when and if it does, we immediately take action because we own it. So let's look at what happened. The first aircraft crashed months ago.
Right.
They had to wait for countries to start to ground their plane before they finally took action. They had a software fix that wasn't into place. If I'm responsible for the lives of the people who died, if that's my mindset, as soon as I find out there's a potential problem, I ground the planes.
Well, yeah, and I think there are some examples in recent history of companies who've done that. Not with planes, but with whatever the issue was, where they've jumped right on it, and the CEO was on the news that afternoon accepting full responsibility and outlining the actions they were taking.
Right. So, that's a current one. It's always easy to project those things on other people.
Right.
So now, we look at our own lives and say, we talked last week a little bit, I think, about the result bears out the intent.
Yeah.
Right. If I see myself as responsible and it goes wrong, I have to go back and say, was I really clear on what I was trying to create here?
Right. Yeah, I think we talked about the unexamined life isn't worth living, and this is a thriving habit that we're hoping our listeners are adopting of reviewing what's actually going on in our lives. Not, we're going to repeat this probably several times, to assign blame, but just to see what happened and make adjustments, because adjustments are always necessary. None of us is going to be perfect at everything. That's a very flawed way of thinking. They say planes flying from LA to Hawaii are off course 80% of the time because they're constantly making course corrections. That is what life is like. But number one, if we don't know what we want, our destination, and number two, if we're not willing to course correct, we're going to be way off course.
Or take ownership for getting to the destination.
Yeah, for starters.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so, you think about this. I was teaching a class a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the topic of responsibility and uncoupling it from blame. And somebody made an interesting observation. I hadn't heard it said quite this way. They said blame is only necessary when true responsibility hasn't been taken.
Oh, that's profound.
Yeah.
Say that again. That's worth putting up on the wall.
Yeah, blame is only necessary when true responsibility hasn't been taken.
All right, well, let's change our focus here and get very personal. We talked about Boeing, and I noticed China just bought a whole bunch of Airbuses. So
right.
That's going to hurt Boeing. There's another implication to their failure along the way. But let's get personal, because, we don't work for Boeing. How do our listeners translate these principles into their lives?
Well, the first one is, like you said, for each one of us, is to take a look at different results, whether they be business results or results in our personal life, and go, wow, am I happy with the result? Is it meeting the vision, the aim, the goal that I had for this? And if it is, to be able to go, wow, awesome, high five, Mm-hmm. If it isn't, to be able to, backtrack and, we could work back up the line and say, well, so what did I do or not do that generated this outcome? Mm-hmm. And then backtrack a little bit further up to the mindset and say, how responsible did I see myself going in? Did I really do a check-in and say, here's the goal I want, here's what I'm trying to create in this situation, do I see myself as being fully responsible for my unique role in bringing that about?
Yeah.
And if so, what am I going to do or not do?
Well, and there's actually a kind of a senior principle that encapsulates all of this. And I'd like to introduce it with a recollection from one of the Star Trek films
Okay.
where they went back in time.
Right.
And they were examining humans in an earlier time period, and Bones, the doctor, was kind of witnessing surgery. And I remember him saying, how barbaric, because his way of, treating a body in the future was so much more refined than, cutting and sawing and so forth. Well, similarly, we're learning that there are more refined ways to get results. We talk about mindset. Well, I think the fundamental understanding here is that we either kind of work with our lives just manipulating external things, people and circumstances, or we work from the inside. We use mindset. We examine our thinking. What is it that's contributing to our behavior? So the question to ask as a senior principle here is, how much am I creating my daily experience from the inside, with mindset, and how much am I just manipulating on the outside?
Right, and I think for most of us, it's probably a combination of both. If we go with current brain science, most of us are operating largely unconsciously.
Right.
And so
sleepwalking through life.
Yeah, so our conscious mindset about creating things is not there. So let's take an example. Let's say that I've got a result of something and it keeps turning out unsatisfactorily. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at it and going, oh my gosh, mm-hmm. I've done it again. Right? Then I can go back and I can probably identify what I did or didn't do mm-hmm. that created that. That sometimes is the easy part, root cause analysis, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, we're talking about going upstream a little further for deeper root cause analysis and saying what is going on in my mindset that, what's the story I'm really invested in here that continues to create this outcome that I don't want?
Well, I can't resist. It's time for the cheese sandwich story. You know the story.
I do.
About the two workers who are on their lunch break, and the one guy complains, cheese sandwiches again. He does this like for 3 or 4 days in a row. Finally, his buddy says, look, if you're tired of cheese sandwiches, why don't you ask your wife to make you different sandwiches? And he says, wife, I'm not married. I make my own sandwiches. So, funny joke. But, we use that as kind of a shorthand for this principle that we're all making our own sandwiches, but we're unconscious of that. And people who repeat behaviors and get the same results over and over again, someone else can look at them and say, well, why don't you ask your wife to make different sandwiches when we may be making our own?
Well, and we use the analogy of Einstein. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results, that's the definition of insanity. Now, the challenge sometimes is I don't know why I keep doing the same thing over and over again, right? And so a lot of times what the mindset exploration leads us into is looking for a deeper internal cause. Mm-hmm. What is it that's going on with me that's unresolved or that I haven't dealt with that I need to deal with in order to truly be coming from a mindset that will help me consistently change my behavior? Well,
and as we know, that gets into deep areas, and a lot of us, get professional help to look at traumas that have resulted in the way we behave, fears that we have. We talked about that this morning at our regular breakfast meeting. Another way, which is a little simpler and more generic, is described in what's known as the observer effect, where now in quantum science they are proving that the way we look at things determines what we see. So a really simple check is just to examine, how am I seeing the situation? If a person's going to work every morning with the same thought, God, I hate working here, and they have that attitude, that is going to color what happens during the day. So, a person could examine, what are the attitudes I hold about what I'm doing, and kind of ferret out where there's attitudes that lack the kind of responsibility we're talking about.
Well, and then another piece, and we bring this up almost every single time, that sometimes what it takes is somebody who's our coaching partner, our peer, thriving buddy, as we call it, who's checking in with me, and I check in with them on their own things, but they're saying, hey, did you do that thing you said you were going to do?
Right.
Because a lot of times what it takes is for us to, through repetitive behaviors that are going to lead us in the right direction, actually creates an upstream effect with our mindset.
Yeah.
If I prove to myself that the story can turn out the way I thought it needed to, versus constantly proving to myself that it cannot.
Well, this is one of the principles involved in true friendship. You know, that you can rely on someone to help you see what you don't see yourself in the moment. I was just at a workshop, and it was really inspiring to hear the presenter, who's, you know, a global phenom, and thousands of people come to his events, saying that for him, he needs about 2 hours every morning of contemplation, meditation, looking at his day to make sure that he's on track during the day. And he said, that's because I tend to slip. I miss things.
Right.
And I heard this and I went, wow, well, you know, if he can do that, I think I can do that. The impression is, I think a lot of times, that if we're really effective, if we're really masterful, say with, you know, our topic today of responsibility, that we're going to be flawless. Well, that's just fundamentally inaccurate, because until the day we die, at least potentially, we're always learning and expanding and getting more effective. As we're doing that, we're going to be able to see, if we're willing to look, or if we have a friend who's willing to help us see, areas where we're not 100% yet.
Right. You know, as you were describing that, I was reflecting on a coaching conversation I had willingly. Two conversations around the same topic with two different outcomes depending on the people. So first conversation, the person is very unhappy where they're working. They don't feel they're being valued and respected. They're not being fully utilized. And so the question is, are you okay with that?
Right.
And the obvious answer is no. That's not the result.
They want that to change, for sure.
Yeah. So the next question is, are you willing to take changes that are necessary within your value system to change that? Yes. All right, let's go upstream. You know, what's your mindset here? Well, this company or this leader doesn't get me, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to try some things to see if we can change that? Yes. So we went through that process. Nothing changed. So now, easy to slip back into victim mindset. I'm not responsible. These are things beyond my control. Are you committed to having a great career that you love? Yes. Okay. If you're committed to that and see yourself as responsible for creating that, are you willing to look outside the company?
Aha, what a great question.
So as soon
kind
as
of a scary question.
Well, yeah. As soon as they realized they had limited themselves to only trying to solve that problem from within the company they were working for, a whole new realm of possibility opened up. I just saw the announcement on LinkedIn yesterday. They are now the head of the very division that they used to work for in their previous company. Really? Yeah. So, I mean, they made the leap, and it was great.
Yeah.
Now, flip side of that is I was working with somebody else going through a very similar situation and said, are you willing to see yourself as responsible for getting that outcome? And they were like, yes. And we went through the same thing. Are you willing to look outside the company? No. Is there a reason why? And they had some very valid reasons why. So now, responsibility. I am seeing myself as responsible for staying in the place where I have a very small to zero chance of getting what I want. That's still taking responsibility.
It is. Yep.
I'm owning the fact that I am not going to take the steps to change this in a broader way.
Right.
And risk versus reward, whatever the decision is, once they came to the realization that they were choosing to stay and live within those limitations, it lifted a tremendous angst off from their system, because they realized, I'm choosing to stay in this.
Well, that's great to see those two examples juxtaposed against each other, because they're very different, and yet the commonality is each individual took responsibility.
Right. And responsibility, I mean, this is something I learned over the years. Responsibility does not connote a specific action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It simply
it's an
means,
attitude. It's a mindset.
Yeah, I am seeing myself as responsible for how I live my life. Now, it gets really interesting when you've got multiple people involved in a project.
Well, no kidding. Another way to look at this, too, is that in our kind of unconscious state, we're programmed to let the environment signal or trigger our behaviors. And a lot of people really believe that the environment has power over them. And in many cases, environmental factors are very significant. However, staying with our principle here of responsibility, am I able to jump the gun, you could say? Can I trigger my response in a situation ahead of it? So,
can you give an example?
Yeah, let's say, well, I can think of an example. Years ago, I've mentioned this a few times where I had a very difficult boss in a TV station where I used to work, and, just the thought of him would trigger my anxiety and so forth. Well, that got me exactly nowhere except in budget fights, etc. Well, at some point I decided to think differently about him. So when I would think of him or when I would see him, I would very arbitrarily and deliberately trigger a very different attitude. Like, oh, he's so different than me. What can I learn from him? Or what a great challenge to get our two personalities in sync. In other words, I took responsibility to change the way I saw him and our relationship. And, you know the story. I've told it a few times. Things blossomed. The whole relationship changed. The budget conversations got better. Our effectiveness increased. But I took responsibility to trigger my own behaviors with a mindset shift before I let the environment do it for me.
As you're saying that, you're reminding me of the follow-up conversation I had with a person who decided to stay in the environment that wasn't satisfactory for them. And that was, go back multiple weeks ago when we talked about infusing your values into everything you do.
Right.
So the next conversation we had was, well, since you're going to stay, how can you start to infuse these values that are important to you into your different interactions so that you're enriching the environment, you're enriching the experience, even though it might not have the full capability. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be interesting. It's an experiment in process to see how willing they are to actually do that and to see how much that actually begins, as you're describing, changes their experience and shifts their own mindset, and as a result, the outcome without having to leave.
Chris, you're exposing something in my understanding right now about the whole woulda, coulda, shoulda complex.
Right.
And I think it's fair to say that a lot of us kind of hang out in this vague zone of discontent, wishing things would be better, not really knowing how to make them better, resigning ourselves to the way they are, and kind of giving up, which is the opposite of what we're talking about. But what you just said, when they realized they were going to stay there, they made that choice, that's accepting a limitation. And, with the concept of freedom that a lot of us yearn for, it can be very impractical. For instance, the only reason I'm free to drive on the freeway is because I have a car and I have the limitation of driving on the right side of the road.
Yes.
Here where we live. Those are limitations. But within those limitations, I can experience some freedom. So I think there's a profound realization here about acknowledging limitations. A person might go, well, I am going to be working here for the next, 5 years. Oh, okay. How can I make this fabulous?
Right.
Go to our personal lives. Person may think, well, we've been married for 20 years and we don't have nearly the joy and fun that we used to have. And they kind of realize that they're grumbling about their relationship. They might just say, well, we're not going to get divorced. We actually like each other a lot. Love is not as present. So if I accept this relationship for the foreseeable future, now that's off the table. I'm no longer wishing things were different externally. I'm accepting this limitation. Now, how can I take responsibility inside here to make this the best it can be?
Yeah, that's a huge shift, and again, it's something that comes out of taking ownership for the choices we make, and for the outcome.
Right.
Even within a limitation, as you said, sometimes especially within a limitation. When we think of doing this with multiple people, one of the challenges, you and I have seen this with clients, is that when a project goes well, there's no problem with everybody happily accepting responsibility for it. When it goes poorly, the challenge is people operate under the unconscious assumption that there's only 100% responsibility available, and they start dividing it up.
Right.
Well, you're partially responsible, and I'm partially responsible. And, of course, what that leads to is a mindset where nobody's fully responsible.
Right.
So
there's a little wiggle room for everybody.
Yeah, and the blame hat gets passed around and so on. So our recipe for changing that is what we call quantum responsibility, that we could operate differently in that each one of us has our own unique scale of 100%. Mm-hmm. And it's up to us to decide, are we going to take full responsibility for our unique role in that?
Yeah, I mean, we use the term quantum because in the quantum world, the math is very different.
Yeah, it's an exponential leap.
I mean, in this case, 100% plus 100% plus 100% equals 100%. It's not 20 plus 30 plus 50 equals 100. It's all 100.
Right, and so if I see myself as fully responsible for my unique role, part of my role, if I see you playing at a lower level, would be to come to you and go, hey, I notice you seem to have slipped down the responsibility scale. Anything I can do to help get you up there?
Yeah.
And you do the same for me.
Yeah, right. And in the way you put that, I hope our listeners can hear the absence of blame. It's not, pointing the finger. It's just, hey, let's illuminate what's going on here, because the presumption is that we're both interested in learning and improving.
Yeah, and creating an outcome that we all said we wanted.
Yeah, which, when you think about it, it's insane to want anything else. You see this on the political scene all the time, arguing about gerrymandering and all this and that, when that whole issue, all these issues are solved immediately if the focus goes on getting a more effective result.
Well, and, I was thinking about this word blame, again, because of this course I taught a few weeks ago. Somebody else said that they realized that when they started blaming somebody, they basically were trying to give themselves permission to stay exactly where they were and do nothing about it.
What a profound point that is. And let's just acknowledge for a moment the weight of the gravity of our routines. We all have a vivid memory of, how we act and what we do day to day. And that's like our default settings.
Right.
It takes more energy to change them than the energy that's in them. That's a lesson I just learned, that, we've got to get our energy up, because to execute a shift requires more energy.
Right. And again, harping on the partner thing, that's why having somebody else come in and help infuse energy with us sometimes will get us over the hump, so to speak, and allow us to start making progress in infusing.
Yeah, and if any listeners are hesitant or kind of reluctant to begin that kind of shared accountability with each other, the thing that I've found works so well is questions. Instead of telling someone something that you see about them, just asking the question, hey, when you said this, I found myself wondering if you meant, or whatever. And in the questioning, it gives them the opportunity to realize it for themselves.
Right. So, big topic. So if you've got stories about responsibility you'd love to share, or realizations, you can write to us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. We really enjoy you tuning into our programs, and always love hearing from you. It's good to find out that we're not just talking to ourselves.
Right, and I'm always thrilled to see we've got listeners from around the world. So thanks to everybody who tunes in.